Fundamentals of web server hacking, web applications, and database attacks. Learning objectives. Describe web-based applications are a constant target for attackers, and they are largely found everywhere for online retail, retail banking, mobile, and Internet of Things. Understand the techniques and methods used by malicious hackers, how they attack web servers, web application, and databases. Understand about web application injection-based vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery. Describe ways in how threat actors exploit authentication, authorization, file inclusion, vulnerabilities, insecure code practices, and client jacking security misconfigurations. Describe security defenses for organizations' web-based assets, and identify system weaknesses if they are part of the penetration testing team. Introduction to web server hacking. Web architecture was developed initially by the Hypertext Markup Language and the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. HTTP is the core transfer protocol for most web communications for the global web. It is simple, stateless, and ASL based protocol, and it is based on the TCP port 80 and comprises of the following stages. 1. Executes the provisions of a TCP request to the IP address and port number within the URL. Promotes requesting of a service by triggering request headers in order to define a method. Accomplishes completion transaction via means of producing response to response headers which contain data. And 4. Doesn't archive any information or data from the transactions and halts the TCP connection. Web servers are the targeted components of network infrastructure. They are vulnerable due to the ability of being exploited via the internet connections. Hackers are unable to gain physical and logical internal and external access, but they can pursue it via the internet connection. Now, HTTP has become the prominent standard for communication on the web, but however, the web architecture for web servers are largely established on the foundations of the HTTP and HTML standards. HTTP also illustrates the following characteristics. It's simple, stateless, ACL-based protocol, TCP session, and doesn't remain open based on port 80. HTTP can be utilized in conjunction with other protocols such as Secure Sockets Layer in order to provide security encryption. The web server comprehensively performs the role of responding to all web browser requests. The Internet Information Services, Apache, and Nginx viewed as market leaders for web servers. Web servers typically run on the following types of applications. You have the hypertext preprocessor, you have the active server pages management, and content management systems such as WordPress, Wix, and ClickFunnels, etc. Here's an example of a web infrastructure. The different components are vulnerable towards being attacked by hackers within a web architecture. Hackers, depending on the type of strategy and the component that has been targeted, could typically implement the following types of tools. They could utilize port scanning, such as Nmap, SuperScan can be used, banner grabbing and enumeration. This involves identifying the server and version type. Typically, Telnet and Netcat can be highly effective here. And vulnerability scanning, again, tools which are implemented to identify gaps that have not been patched up. OpenVAS and Nessus are examples of vulnerability scanners. Scanning web servers. Hackers, once they have narrowed the range for the IP addresses, pursue identifying for web services. Typical standards for web servers perform on port 80 or port 443, but hackers may widen the search and can scan for the following types of other ports when pursuing investigations or web applications to attack. These can be port 80, HTTP, port 88, Kerberos, port 443, SSL, port 8005, Apache Tomcat, port 8080, Squid, or port 9090, also known as Sunweb Web Server Admin. Tools which are exercised for pursuing the search for the above services are typically similar to the ones implemented within the footprinting and scanning. The following are known to be amongst the most prominent ones. You have ID Serve, Superscan, and also Nmap. Banner grabbing and enumeration. Once a hacker has been effectively successful in identifying the types of web servers which exist, the hacker will simply pursue steps to elicit additional details about the server and all the associated components. Now, the common types of web servers entail the following. You have the IIS web server, the Apache web server, Nginx web server, and also the Oracle iPlanet web server. The following are the types of enumeration tools which can be employed by a hacker to identify details about a web server. Netcraft, Telnet, IDServe, HTTP Recon, Dementray, Netcat, Nmap scripting engine. Website Ripper tools. Websites can be examined in detail using a website Ripper tool, which empowers hackers to mirror a website and duplicate a website and store it on a hard drive. The scope of these tools empower a hacker to examine all the HTML code of the website and identify useful information. The following tools can be used as the website Ripper tools. Black Window, that is a Windows website scanner and Ripper, HTTP Print, Windows website scanner and site mapping tool, and Widget is a command line for Windows and Unix. Web server vulnerability identification. Once a hacker has recognized the exact vendor and version of the web server, the next step for the hacker is to identify the vulnerabilities. Hackers can typically utilize the following types to identify vulnerabilities for all current and out of systems. Exploit.com, securityfocus.com, Packet Storm Security, and also nvd.nist.gov tools. Launching attacks on web servers. Web servers in a network environment are vulnerable to the following types of attacks: DOS, DDoS attacks, DNS server hijacking, DNS amplification attacks, directory traversal, man in the middle, website defacement, web server misconfiguration, HTTP response splitting, and also web server password cracking. DOS and DDoS attacks. These type of attacks allow the disruption to the normal communication to the users, a larger threat to the internet, and has the potential of disrupting an entire network. DNS server hijacking and DNS amplification attacks. Hackers that are able to access DNS servers are able to pursue DNS server hijacking simply by implementing changes to a DNS setting in order to channel all forms of incoming requests to the web server for a unique malicious site. Application attacks can also be pursued through DNS server hijacking, which entails targeting DNS servers that support recursive delay. Now, the intent of this attack is to convert the small forms of DNS query into a large-scale payload effectively aimed at the target network, typically resulting in an initial request of 80 bytes into a cluster of 8,000 bytes. This is an example of an attacker using the DNSSEC, simply adding larger volume of data. Directory traversal. This attack comprises of capitalizing on insufficient security validation. The intent of this attack is simply to gain access to the file system through exploiting applications which are affected. Now, also known as the // attack, directory climbing and backtracking, the Nmap script can be utilized to search for security vulnerability. Man in the middle attacks. The intent of the attack is to modify the way two parties communicate with one another. Active eavesdropping is an example of man in the middle attacks, in which an attacker establishes independent connections between two parties and plays a part of relaying messages to both parties with the intent of making them believe that engaging with one another in a private conversation. Website defacement. Scope of this type of attack is to modify the visual appearance of a website. Password guessing, vulnerability exploit, and SQL injection, common forms of attacks. Website misconfiguration. Hackers are able to modify the httpd.conf file, which contains in-depth information about the web server and its usage. A hacker is also able to modify the php.ini file, which largely contains the error messages associated with the web server. HTTP response splitting. Uh, this forms an attack which is used to perform cross-site scripting attacks, cross-user defacement, and web cache poisoning. The following types of three parties are involved in a HTTP response splitting attack: a web server, a component which has security vulnerability, a target, a component in the form of a cache server forward, a reverse proxy or browser which is used to perform on behalf of the server and engages with the web server, and three, an attacker performs the role of engaging and initiating the attack. Web server password cracking. A role of authentication is to promote confidence that all forms of sensitive information and all implemented controls are not tampered with from any unauthorized users. Authenticating users can be exercised by implementing the following types of techniques: username and password, token of smart card, fingerprints, retainer scans, voice recognition. Hackers employ tools such as WP Scan in order to identify all forms of common passwords. The following is a website which is often referred to as back from hackers. Microsoft Information Service vulnerabilities. Contains many enhanced versions. Nevertheless, web servers are so vulnerable to being attacked. Patching, hardening, and constantly updating the web server is the most effective method to minimize the possibilities of attacks. Published vulnerabilities of IIS include the following: SAPI DLL buffer overflow attack. The scope of this attack entails a hacker exploiting the IDQ.LL, and when it is executed, this results in a large buffer overflow, which results in compromising servers operating on IIS. The malicious element of this attack is that the server's part of the indexing doesn't have to be actively operating. Since IDQL performs in the capacity of a system, the hacker is able to elevate his rights and permissions, is able to endorse himself as the authorized administrator. To source disclosure attacks. These attacks can also be employed by hackers in the pursuit to unfold web design, passwords, and even business logic. The web distributed authoring and versioning is a known example of source disclosure attack. The scope of this attack entails the attacker attacking a vulnerability with an IIS 5.1 or stroke 6.0 version that enables the user to be able to gain access into secured web dev folders by performing a search for a password protected folder and retrieve the folder. Hackers can typically employ an nmap script to identify this vulnerability. Patching, hardening, and constantly keeping the web server updated are known methods to minimize probability of attacks. However, even the latest Windows servers are not immune from being attacked. Attacks widen their scope in the event to identify vulnerabilities. It is imperative that HTTP attack connections are secure and encrypted. Failure to do so will allow clear text connections to the server. All hacker activities are captured in the log files. However, they make every effort to remove or alter them. Attacker's IP address can also be traced in the event logging has been enabled. WebTech tool empowers the hacker to customize HTTP requests and scrutinize the response details aligned to the web server. Web servers are not only components that are vulnerable to attack, but also associated services which can potentially be accessed by the hacker are all vulnerable. Metasploit tool typically employed by hackers to pursue buffer overflow attacks. Automated exploit tools employed by hackers to exploit and attack web servers. The Metasploit tool is a prominent example of all exploit testing and development tool. The Metasploit tool permits users to populate an IP address with port number and of the target machine and implement the desired exploit against the machine in a very simple and effective manner. It also permits the victim to respond back and open a command shell on a victim or inject and execute code on the victim. Once a shell is incorporated onto the victim, the hacker is very near the objective of gaining authorized user access. Browser exploitation framework is another tool that can be employed by attackers to assess security vulnerabilities of a given web browser and performs the task of modifying browser settings without the user's consent. It comprises modules such as browser overflows, cross-site scripting, keylogging, and clipboard theft, which can be loaded to target set browsers, web applications, and databases. Canvas, a commercial tool that has automated attack and penetration capabilities, known to be more advanced than Metasploit. Core Impact, an advanced commercial penetration testing tool suite, superior point and click automated exploit and automated tool. Securing web servers. Protecting web servers from attackers demands in depth defense techniques, and the following are principles that should be adopted. The network must be safe and protected before any forms of web servers are rolled out on the network. Ensure all security patches, critical updates, and automated patch management is implemented using tools such as Windows Server Update Services, GFI, LandGuard. Disable all web server services which are no longer required. Tools such as the following can be utilized to effectively disable all services: Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, IIS Lockdown, SOAP UI, Retina CS. 4. Implement encryption and enable file level security in order to lock down the file system. Track all activities within the web server and maintain auditing. Consistently perform daily scans for all vulnerabilities using automated assessment tools such as the following: Nessus, a powerful security scanning and auditing tool, cross-platform vulnerability scanner available for Unix, Linux, Windows servers, a Kuntex web vulnerability scanner, industry-recognized scanning, identification of web server, web applications, and SQL injection suites, comprises of advanced penetration testing tools such as HTTP, fusing, and Ajax testing. IBM Internet Scanner, available for Windows and provides comprehensive vulnerability scanning and identification across networks and devices via a CLI and GUI. Retina CS, available for Windows and can perform vulnerability scanning across systems, wired and wireless network devices. GFI LandGuard, a comprehensive server scanner which produces reports for missing security patches, open ports, weak passports, key registry entries, etc. Web application hacking. The scope of web application hacking entails the hacker identifying web applications and understanding the business logic of the applications. Web applications can be attacked in the following ways: unvalidated input, parameter informed tampering, injection flaws, cross site scripting, cross site request forgery attacks, hidden field attacks, attacking web based authentication, web based password cracking, web based authentication attacks, and intercepting web traffic. Unvalidated output. This type of attack arises due to the fact when validation isn't performed on client input before being processed. All input is bad input, therefore it must be tested at all times. In the event input controls are implemented within web browsers to validate user input, attackers can employ tools such as OSWASP, Z Application Proxy, or BERT Proxy and incorporate their own input. Attacks input could create events of data manipulation, theft, or even system malfunction. Parameter form tampering. This type of attack is implemented in the event when the URL parameters are manipulated between the client and the web application. The typical activities that could encompass the following: price changing, permission access, level of access to a web application. Injection flaws. The activity of injection flaws can be depicted as an event where untrusted data is executed as trusted data in the form of a valid command. The typical forms of injection flaws comprise of the following: SQL injection. This attack comprises of manipulating the structured query language queries that are aimed for the backend database. Command injection. This type of attack entails injecting and executing commands designed by an attacker toward a vulnerable application. Command injection attacks occur due to lack of data validation that is manipulated by attackers in the form of HTTP headers, cookies, forms, etc. File injection. This attack entails a hacker injecting a file that is remotely hosted in order to manipulate and exploit vulnerable scripts. LDPAP injection. Lightweight directory access protocol services run on TCP port 389 and SSL services run on TCP port 636. In the event where web services have weaknesses in design and poor code, attackers can now inject unvalidated application input using LDAP commands in order to access the database behind the LDAP tree. XML injection. This attack comprises of hacker injecting XML via XPath injection a web services application. The intent of the attack is to target the XML document. Hackers typically employ strings of malicious code in order to retrieve secure information. Cross-site scripting and cross-site request forgery attacks. Hackers employ cross-site scripting and attacking techniques by injecting malicious code using a web application to dynamically generated web pages. Hackers trick users to click on a web link, which consequently would elicit data, steal cookies, and inject harmful code. Hackers are also known to exploit HTML forms when employing the cross-site scripting method of attack. In the event of HTML forms, the web server is also known to capture the form data and display it back to the user to confirm any confirmation. Hackers are also known to incorporate the following techniques when executing the cross-site scripting: sending links embedded within emails that will release malicious code, exploiting cookies, sending authorized requests, inserting attacks on a web page. XSS attacks can be diffused by implementing patching vulnerable programs and validation of user input in a dynamic web page. Cross-site request forgery is an attack that forces an end user to execute unwanted actions on a web application in which they're currently authenticated. CSRF attacks specifically target state-changing requests, not theft of data, since the attacker has no way to see the response to the forged request. Hidden field manipulation attacks. When a user makes selection on an HTML page, the selection is typically stored as form field values and sent to the application as an HTTP request, GET, or POST. HTML can also store field values as hidden values, which are not rendered to the screen by the browser, but are collected and submitted as parameters during form submission. Attackers can also examine the HTML code of the page and change the hidden field values in order to change post requests to the server. Other web application attacks. The following are the types of security issues which occur due to a lack of validation output. Session fixation. User is manipulated and tricked by the attacker towards gaining access to a web server based on unique session ID value. This is achieved via client-side script, HTTP, header response, or meta tag, direct OS commands, unauthorized execution of commands, and then SOAP injection. Malicious query strings are injected by hackers into the user input field in order to overcome the web services authentication. Path traversal, a technique implemented by the attacker to move from one directory to another. URL encoding, technique employed by hackers to implement execution of an invalid application request via an HTTP request. Unicode encoding, technique implemented by hackers to bypass security filters. Hex encoding implemented by attacker to obscure a URL. Attacking a web-based application. The following are the most common authentication types. Basic, achieved through a process of exclusive or ING. Authentication initially triggered when user requests for authorized resource. Username and password dialog box is prompted. Username and password sent to server via HTTP. Data encoded by XOR, binary operations. XOR functions by converting all letters, symbols, and numbers to ASL text, which are depicted in a binary equivalent. XOR values sent by HTTP and is encrypted, and this is known as the weakest form of authentication. So, Message Digest, significant improvement over basic authentication, implements the MD5 hashing algorithm based on challenge response protocol, implements username, password, and no one's value to establish encrypted value sent to server. No one's value upholds resistance towards cracking and sniffing attacks, depicted in the RFC 5216. NTLM authentication is offshoot authentication method. Certificate-based, strongest form of authentication. User authenticate to the web server by presenting their certificates. Certificate comprises of public key and signature of certificate authority. Web server performs verification of certificate signature by using public key cryptography. Forms-based, largely used throughout the internet, operates based on the usage of a cookie that is released to client. Cookie or session variable is generated once authentication has been performed. Stored cookie reused on repeated visits. Web-based password cracking and authentication attacks. Hackers can employ the following types of password attack techniques in order to hack into web-based applications. Dictionary attacks. Attacks use a text file which largely comprises of passwords that is implemented into a password program that is used against user accounts held within the application. Tools such as LCP, Hashcat, Brutus, and THC Hydra are widely used. Web-based password cracking and authentication attacks. Hybrid attacks incorporates numbers and symbols very similar to data dictionary attack. Brute force attacks, most comprehensive form of attack, time-consuming, most intrusive, and easily detectable. Attackers are also known to employ the following types of password cracking tools. Brutus, functional capability of performing large-scale remote dictionary or brute force attacks against Telnet, FTP, SNMP, and web servers. Web cracker, tools which contain lists of passwords and usernames and execute them in the form of dictionaries in order to perform password guessing at the basic authentication level. THC Hyrida, a prominent password cracking tool which attacks many common authentication schemes. Burp Suite, used for brute force attacks, fully featured web application penetrating testing tool set. Features include an intruder module which permits users to customize requests to manipulate and inject diverse range of data payloads, implements various password combinations. Cookies established with a legitimate purpose, useful for applications to capture location, time, date, username, passwords, and store it in the browser. Following tools can be employed by attackers to view cookies. Cookie spy that can be used to disclose cookie contents and their usage. Burp Suite examines cookie vulnerabilities, identifies passwords and usernames if stored in cookies. URL obfuscation. The following are the most common encoding schemes used by web application designers when practicing security by using obscurity: hex, HTML, base64, Unicode. Intercepting web traffic. Web applications can be observed using sniffers or proxies in order to comprehensively understand how they work. The following proxies are the most common ones that are used: Burp proxy, Paros proxy, OWASP, ZAP. Web proxies enable penetration testers to attack and debug applications and act as a middleman which enable you to intercept, inspect, and implement changes to the raw contents within the traffic. Terms intercept enable you to view, send, and receive traffic from the client to the server. Inspect enable you to examine the structure and components of the application. Modify enable you to make amendments and changes to the data to view the response of the application, i.e. injection attacks. The following tools permit testers to perform the following activities: SQL injection, cookie subversion, buffer overflows, etc. Securing web applications. Source scanners can be implemented to identify vulnerabilities in the source code. Source scanners can also detect the following: buffer overflows, race conditions, privilege escalations, and tainted input. Buffer overflows exist when a program attempts to input more data in a buffer than it can hold in a given memory area. The best known form of software security vulnerability. Race conditions can prevent protective systems from functioning properly and block available resources to the system. Privilege escalation occurs when code runs with higher privileges than that of the user who executed it. Tainting of input allows potentially unchecked data through your defenses, possibly qualified as already error checked information. The following tools which can be utilized to identify the above problems. Flaw Finder, a Python program, searches within source code to identify security flaws. Rough auditing tool for security, RATS. It can scan C, C++, Perl, PHP, and Python for vulnerabilities and potential buffer overflows. StackGuard protects Linux and window applications from buffer overflow and stack smashing attacks. Whisker orders web application scanner and checks for common gateway interface vulnerabilities. NStalker GUI-based application assessment tool that maintains database of 30,000 vulnerabilities and exploits. WebInspect, a web application vulnerability scanning tool that scans for more than 1,500 known web server and application vulnerabilities. App Detective Pro, an application level scanner that performs penetration and audit tests. Penetration test examines your system from a hacker's point of view. Database hacking. Databases are important to business, government, and individuals because they contain customer data, credit card numbers, passwords, and other proprietary secrets. Databases can be centralized, distributed, and are largely dependent on the type of database management systems that have been implemented. Database types can be the following: hierarchical database management system. In this database type, the links are arranged in a tree structure. In this type, each record only has one owner. Network database management system. In this database type, the network is more flexible and each record can have multiple parent and child records. Relational database management system. In this database type, the database is a collection of tables which are aligned with primary keys. Most relational databases use SQL as a query language. Object-oriented database management system. In this database type, the database overcomes the limitations of the relational databases. Object-oriented databases don't use a high-level language such as SQL. These databases support modeling and the creation of data as objects. Identifying SQL servers. Database vulnerabilities can occur in all database types, such as the following: Oracle NetListener, Microsoft SQL, MySQL. SQL injection occurs when an attacker is able to insert SQL statements into a query by means of a SQL injection vulnerability. SQL injections allow the attacker to take advantage of unsecured code on a system and pass commands directly to a database. Servers that have been compromised via SQL injections are likely to experience shutdown, have commands exercised on them, and have all databases being extracted. Attacks proactively perform investigation on database servers that can be exploited using SQL injections. Nmap scripts can be implemented in a search to channel the exploitation search. SQL injection can be implemented using the following high-level steps. Footprinting, identify the type of database technology which is in scope. Identifying all forms of user input points. Testing test user input which are accessible to the attack. Exploiting, incorporate malicious code on a target device to effectively execute the commands. SQL injection techniques include the following. Simple SQL injection capitalizes on unvalidated input. Union SQL injection utilizes a union select command in order to return the union of a target database. Error-based SQL injection. The intent is to enter purely constructed statements in order to get target database to respond with required tables names and error messages. Blind SQL injection utilized when attacker has full awareness that the database is susceptible to SQL injection attacks. Attackers employ series of true and false statements in order to extract data. SQL injection hacking tools. The following are the types of tools that can be employed to hack SQL databases. SQL-Dict executes a dictionary attack against the SQL server. SQL exec implements commands on a compromised SQL server. SQL-BF password cracking program which has capabilities to inject both dictionary and brute force attacks. BSQL hacker, an automated SQL injection tool.
SQL2.exe. This UDP buffer overflow attack returns a command prompt to the attacker. Marathon tool utilized for time-based blind SQL injection testing. SQL Power Injector, a SQL injection exploit. A Hijacking implemented to exercise backend database fingerprinting, elicit DB, MS login names and passwords, dump tables, fetch data. It can execute SQL statements and access any underlying file systems of SQL servers. And last but not least, Absent, which is an SQL injection exploit.